Okay, so welcome back to The Young Idealist and my series on classical German philosophy and German idealism. I'm very grateful. I have a very special guest today. I have Colin McQuillan. I came across Colin's work actually through a friend of mine who I've also had on this channel, Ben Norris, um, and he recommended your work. But I also read one of your brilliant essays in this collection of Kant and his German contemporaries. Um, your essay, Baumgarten, Meyer, and Kant on aesthetic perfection, which has deeply helped me in navigating through Kant's influence on aesthetics. So I found it very rich, very articulate, and very lucid. So thank you for that. Um, and thank you for being here. So Dr. McQuillan is a professor who has taught at St. Mary's since 2012. His research concerns the history of modern European philosophy, especially the history of aesthetics and the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. He's the author and editor of 5 books, as well as numerous articles and reviews. So thank you for being here today,
Well,
Colin.
thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of the series. I've watched some of the other videos, and yeah, I am honored to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
You have no idea how hard it was to find someone to speak on Kant today, but I'm really glad it's you. And I've gone through some of your work on philosophy papers, some of your work on Baumgarten and some other articles on Kant, which have been really, really good. And I will post those links as well in the video so other people can take a look at your work because I think it's very meaningful. So I think we can jump right in. And I wanted to hear what I like to do in this series is talk about who the philosopher was, their significance to philosophy and the history of philosophy, talk a little bit about their life, and then kind of move in slowly to their work. So I guess my first question to you is, who was Immanuel Kant? What makes him a significant thinker in the history of philosophy, and why should we read today? That's a kind of a mouthful, sorry.
Yeah. So thank you again. I think the best way to think about Immanuel Kant is that he's an 18th century German philosopher. So he's born in 1724. He dies in 1804. And the reason to study him today, or his significance for the history of philosophy, is that if you study the history of philosophy, you find that Kant is sort of at the center of a lot of narratives about modern European philosophy. So there's, the old story about early modern rationalism and empiricism, and the way Kant gets fit into that narrative is sort of as the one who overcomes the divide between rationalism and empiricism and sort of synthesizes the best of each. Kant himself and his students had a role in formulating and promoting that narrative, which is one reason to study Kant. But if you read other sort of 19th and 20th century philosophers, you find sort of the German idealists treat Kant as a predecessor. You find phenomenologists treating Kant as a sort of predecessor for what they're doing. Both Husserl and Heidegger do that. And you also find analytic philosophers, whether it's A.J. Ayer or Peter Strawson, sort of appealing back to Kant as a sort of source that sort of gives their own work legitimacy and status and a sort of place in the history of modern philosophy. So the fact that Kant has been a resource for all those different philosophical schools and traditions, I think makes it inherently interesting. And one of the reasons to go back and study Kant is to actually get a critical perspective on those schools and traditions. So one thing that I always warn students is that philosophers read selectively. They read to find what they're interested in. And so you find somebody like A.J. Ayer at the beginning of Language, Truth, and Logic, where he's talking about the elimination of metaphysics and theology, actually appealing to Kant as a sort of, a philosopher who was involved in that project. And then you go back and read Kant, and he's talking about making metaphysics a science as opposed to eliminating metaphysics. And you get a sense of how philosophers work, how they treat their predecessors, and it's good to be a little bit critical and not to not to take philosophers at their word when they say that their predecessors do this or that another philosopher takes this position, or that their argument works in this or that way. That's something that we should know for ourselves, and we should be critical and responsible in the way we make judgments about those things. So that's really what drew me to Kant, and why I think studying Kant is actually so rewarding, is that it's sort of a point where all these different schools and traditions come together, and all these different philosophical programs or campaigns kind of meet. And by actually studying Kant and seeing how he gets appropriated and transformed through reception and transmission, you really get a good sense of how philosophy works in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Thank you for that very detailed answer. That was wonderful, actually. I was wondering if maybe you could take us through Kant's life. I mean, there are many, what's it called? A lot of people know about, they could fix their watch to five in the morning and he'd be walking around in Königsberg, but maybe you can take us through little events of his life.
Sure. So, I mean, the joke about Kant, which comes from Heinrich Heine, is that he had no biography. And the way Heine cites that story about, the housewives of Königsberg setting their watches or setting their clocks by his daily walks, that's actually a dirty joke. And, one of the virtues of an education is that it allows you to appreciate a different class of humor. I don't know who said that. I'm paraphrasing, but that reference to the housewives of Königsberg setting their watches by Kant's daily walks is actually a reference to Tristram Shandy and the marital responsibilities of Tristram's father. So, the fact that people cite this story about Kant without realizing that it's actually a joke in the original kind of shows you something like we might be missing some things about Kant's biography. It's true that he doesn't have a kind of swashbuckling life. He's not a world traveler. He's not the kind of philosopher who changes the world through his, just sort of depth of understanding, or he's not like a jet-setting contemporary academic in the way that a lot of famous superstar academics are today. But I think Kant's biography is actually interesting, partly because of its the ordinariness of large parts of it. So Kant is born in Königsberg, which is in East Prussia, which is sometimes treated as a backwater. But it's the traditional capital of the Duchy of Prussia. That becomes the Kingdom of Prussia, the political history of Prussia, its unification with Brandenburg in the 17th and 18th century is very interesting. That's getting into some sort of political history that goes beyond my expertise in the history of philosophy, but that's stuff that is relevant to Kant's biography. It's also worthwhile to note that Kant's father is a harness maker, so he comes from a kind of middle-class background. So he's not, the younger son of an aristocrat or something like that. His parents are involved with German pietism, which is also an interesting part of Kant's life story. Although some people talk about Kant as a pietist, I actually think Kant is an anti-pietist because he both rejects the kind of sentimental approach to religion that pietists tend to promote, and because he rejects the kind of education that pietists provide in the schools they set up, especially the role that corporal punishment plays in sort of pietist education. So, he grows up in kind of a middle-class family. He has a religious upbringing that he doesn't entirely reject, but rejects to a certain degree. He goes to university. So 1740 is when he enrolls in the University of Königsberg. His mother died shortly before that. His mother died in 1737. His father dies in 1746, which means early in Kant's academic career, he doesn't have the kind of family support that a lot of other academics, certainly at this time, would have had. And he makes his way. So he works as a tutor and then as a lecturer at the university. He spends some time working as a librarian in addition to being a lecturer. And he doesn't get an appointment as a professor until he's 46 years old in 1770. And I think that is worth noting. So unlike many of us, Kant had a lot of different competing offers for positions in the years before he accepted his position in Königsberg. And it's interesting to note that he preferred to stay in his hometown rather than moving to bigger universities where he was offered better salaries and things like that. And that tells you something about him and his lifestyle and the conditions of academic work in the 18th century, which I think those of us who are professors or academics should find interesting and are relevant to understanding definitely the form in which philosophy is presented. One of the things that I've found reading Wolff and Baumgarten and those kinds of philosophers is that a lot of people dismiss them because they're boring. So I think Louis White Beck says that Wolff proves what needs no proof and moves with glacial celerity. Well, part of the problem is that he's reading textbooks. Like these are books that are written and published for the purpose of educating undergraduate students. They're not works that are written for professional academic philosophers. And so I try to keep that in mind when I'm reading works of academic philosophy from the 18th century, or academic journal articles today. They don't have to be exciting. They don't have to be world-changing. They have to be informative. And there are institutional reasons why they take the form that they do. And I think Kant is an academic philosopher. So he often refers to his critical philosophy as a scholastic philosophy. And I think that is something to keep in mind because Kant is a professor. He is teaching philosophy in a university, and he's writing philosophy for other academic philosophers. So that's something about the sort of mundanity of Kant's life. But it's also worth noting that he's a political Republican who lives in an absolute monarchy and who publishes sort of works on history and politics that make the case for rule of law and Republican government. And he's sort of strategic about the way that he talks about Frederick the Great or the monarchy or the Prussian government, but he's also very clear about his support for Republican politics and his idea that that's the only form of government that's actually respectful of human beings as rational beings. That is not the most common or widely held perspective in the 18th century, much less in Prussia. So that's noteworthy. And it's also noteworthy that Kant has a pretty complicated relationship to religion, right? He's censored for the way he writes about religion. He kind of gets around a ban on publishing on religion. Yeah, and that's, there are people who know more about that than me, and there are people who are better judges of Kant's sort of philosophical theology than I am. But I also think that is unique and distinctive about Kant, and worth taking seriously as part of his biography, both his politics and his religion, and the way he approaches both of them philosophically and publishes about both of them um, in a political context where that's risky, or in a social context where that's risky.
I really appreciate you highlighting his politics. That's great. You really gave us a nice detailed summation of his life. And now I know I won't use that that thing from Heine anymore. But one of the good things about yes, yes, yes. One of the good things about having you here, and because of your scholarship and your work, is I can ask you this question, and know you'll have a nice detailed. You'll know what you're talking. Well, you'll know what you're talking about. Kant's influences. Who influenced Kant in his philosophical enterprise or endeavor?
Yeah, so I think there's been a tendency in the scholarship to focus on a few big names. So, Hume is one name that a lot gets thrown around a lot, or Locke, or Leibniz. There is a tendency to approach Kant's sources as if he's responding to other philosophers that we're familiar with and that we read and that are part of the sort of curriculum or canon of philosophy today. And there's some truth to that. Kant does talk about Hume, and he talks about Locke, and he talks about Leibniz. How much of any of them he actually read, I find, I think there's little evidence that he read very much of any of them, or that they're the real sources of the positions that he takes on different issues. My view is that Kant's sources are mostly 18th century German philosophers. And I'll distinguish between academic philosophers and then non-academic philosophers, because I think if you look at the University of Königsberg when Kant is a student, his professors are pretty eclectic. Manfred Kuhn does a pretty good job in his biography of laying out what the philosophical faculty in Königsberg looks like when Kant is a student and the different backgrounds of his professors. So that's in Kuhn's Immanuel Kant biography. And you basically see they're pretty eclectic. They're drawing on Aristotle, they're drawing on Newton, they're drawing on Locke. Some of them are pietists, some of them are not, some of them are Wolffian to a certain degree. There is an 18th century academic discourse which combines, well, let me step back a second and just say, academic discourse in 18th century Germany is relatively eclectic in philosophy. It draws on a wide range of sources, and drawing sharp lines between, who's an Aristotelian and who's a Wolffian is not easy to do, because they're reading different sources and combining things in idiosyncratic ways. So I think Kant is never an orthodox Wolffian by any stretch of the imagination, but he draws a lot on Wolffian philosophers like Baumgarten and Meyer, who are not orthodox Wolffians either, but use a lot of Wolffian terminology and defend many Wolffian positions, whether it's pre-established harmony. Meyer defends that very strongly. Or the way Baumgarten sets up his metaphysics, it's very much reliant on Wolff's metaphysics, even if Baumgarten varies some of the definitions and arguments and proofs and things like that. I think Kant draws heavily on those sources, and he supplements them with people like Newton and the sort of German reception of Newton. But he's also interested in people like Moses Mendelssohn. And he, I think, really respects and admires Mendelssohn for most of his career. I think when you get into the 1790s, after Mendelssohn's death, Kant says some things about Mendelssohn that are wrong, and also very hostile. And so I think there's a change in Kant's attitude towards Mendelssohn after Mendelssohn dies, and it may have to do with, Mendelssohn not defending the Critique of Pure Reason the way Kant wanted him to, or something like that. That's speculative, but I think Mendelssohn is an important source for Kant and an important influence on Kant's academic career. And then there are people like Crucius as well, who are important resources. And Crucius is kind of an anti-Wolffian philosopher, and Kant combines certain aspects of the Wolffian tradition with the Crucian philosophy. And as a result, I think, Kant's philosophical influences are German, they're 18th century, they're academic and non-academic. A lot of them are untranslated. A lot of them are boring to read. So you're reading textbooks, you're reading, Baumgarten's Metaphysics or Mayer's logic textbook. That, I think, is the best way to understand where Kant is coming from. That gives you a key to Kant's terminology. It tells you why he's concerned about some of the problems that he's concerned about. And it really highlights where Kant departs from his predecessors and contemporaries. I think if you don't know the kind of Wolffian tradition or Crucius or Baumgarten or Meyer, you might think Kant is responding to something like Hume or Locke. In fact, it's coming from a more specifically German philosophical discussion.
Thank you for that.
I hope that was coherent. I feel
No, that was perfect. Actually, it's so funny that you said that about Leibniz, because last night I was reading the Cambridge edition of Leibniz's new essays on human understanding, and Jonathan Bennett's introduction to that says, we're not even sure how much Leibniz Kant read, but because of the dialogue. So the dialogue was set, it's a dialogue between Leibniz essentially and Locke, and Locke passed away and wasn't able to respond to it, and Leibniz felt kind of in bad faith to publish it while Locke has passed away, and it didn't get published until 1765. And Bennett says that if Kant were to read anything by Leibniz, it would have been the dialogue that had just been translated in 1765.
Yeah, so I think there's some scholarship that says like Kant does read that when it's published. He probably did read some other pieces by Leibniz, but I think we sometimes forget that most of Leibniz's writings weren't published until the 19th and 20th centuries. And so even Christian Wolff hadn't read a lot of Leibniz. And when people talk about sort of the Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy, Wolff rejected that because on the one hand, he wanted to say, no, I stand on my own 2 feet. But both Leibniz and Wolff said that Wolff hadn't read all that much of Leibniz on philosophy. So they talked a lot in their correspondence about mathematics. They talk some about philosophy. They talk about sort of academic and institutional politics. But there's a lot of Leibniz that neither Wolff nor Kant were aware of. I think, right, they're clearly aware of some stuff in the Monadology and the Odyssey. The early essay, Meditations on Knowledge, Truth, and Ideas, I think is a Leibniz essay that just has this amazing kind of influence from Wolff to Baumgarten. And Kant is actually one of the philosophers who decisively rejects some of the ideas that, I think were just sort of common currency in German philosophers in the 18th century. This idea that sensible cognition is confused and intellectual cognition is distinct. For Baumgarten, that's key to Wolff's logic. Baumgarten makes it the distinction between aesthetics and logic. And Kant says in the inaugural dissertation, nope, You can't use confusion and distinctness to distinguish between sensible and intellectual cognition. That's not the dividing line between intuitions and concepts. And I think that's one of the areas where, if you know the sort of German academic discourse, you really understand where Kant is coming from. And if you don't know that discourse, then it just looks pretty idiosyncratic when you're reading Kant. Why would he bother fighting against this view or criticizing this view? Like, to contemporary philosophers, it just seems like a ridiculous way to distinguish between, the senses and the intellect. But in context, in the 18th century, it was a really important position.
Thank you for that. When you see anything on Kant, you see the word, you see the question, the Copernican revolution. I was wondering if you could, what is the Copernican revolution, and how does it have a relation to Kant and Kant's project as a whole?
Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit snarky here and say that the Copernican revolution is a widely overrated and misunderstood passage in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. So I have it here, and I'll read it. This is in Geyer and Wood's translation published by Cambridge. Kant says, "Up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects, but all attempts to find out something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Hence, let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest." So that's the passage in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, the so-called B edition of 1787, that people call the Copernican Revolution. And the way this gets interpreted, sort of and narrated in the history of modern European philosophy, is that Kant is challenging us to look at the subjective conditions of knowledge instead of the objective conditions of knowledge. That is, if we look to the mind rather than to the world, we'll be better able to understand the conditions of knowledge. I think there's something wrong with that story about the Copernican revolution, because what Kant is really talking about in this passage is a priori cognition. So it's not just cognition in general, in which case looking at objects would actually be a pretty good way to find out about objects, right? We can learn a lot about objects by observing them and examining them and experimenting with them. And there's nothing wrong with sort of empirical knowledge derived from experience of the world. There is something wrong if you're trying to derive a priori knowledge from experience of the world, because a priori knowledge is, or cognition is by definition not derived from experience. So the problem with trying to derive a priori cognition from experience is that it's inherently contradictory. Therefore, you can't derive it from objects because you'd have to experience the objects to know about them. So what Kant is saying is we have to look at the a priori conditions of knowledge in order to understand a priori cognition at all. That's the only consistent way to get something like a priori cognition, or to demonstrate the possibility of a priori cognition. And if you look at the passages that follow the Copernican revolution, he talks about the possibility of a priori intuition, which you're obviously not going to get a priori cognition from a posteriori sensations. He talks about the possibility of a priori concepts, which you're obviously not going to get a priori concepts from experience of objects. If your concept of an object is derived from the experience of the object, it's not going to be a priori. And then he talks about a priori concepts of reason or ideas. And he also just says, like, these have to be a priori, therefore they can't be derived from experience. So Kant's concern is really with a priori cognition. The Copernican revolution is really an attempt to demonstrate that a priori cognition is possible. And the reason that's important is because Kant thinks metaphysics is a science of a priori cognition. I've published an article about this, and I think what's interesting is that a lot of us assume that, oh, well, rationalists in early modern European philosophy all thought metaphysics was a science of a priori cognition, which is not at all true. If you look at Leibniz or Wolff, they have no problem saying, well, knowledge can be a priori or a posteriori. It's the same knowledge, the same truth. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Whether we acquire knowledge from experience or deduce it from definitions or something like that, doesn't matter. Same knowledge, same truth in the end. They are not discriminating with regard to the source of knowledge. It's Kant who's discriminating about the sources of knowledge in metaphysics. And so Kant is actually a much more extreme rationalist than his so-called rationalist predecessors. Because Kant is the one who says metaphysics is solely concerned with a priori cognition, whether that's a priori, the a priori principles of sensibility and the transcendental aesthetic, or the pure concepts of the understanding or the pure concepts of reason. Everything in the critique of pure reason is a priori. Nothing is derived from experience. That is the rationalist, the hardline rationalism that Kant is advocating in the Critique of Pure Reason. And I realize, like, that's not the way we generally talk about Kant. We don't talk about Kant as a rationalist. We talk about him as somebody who defines the limits of reason or the bounds of sense, and says, the use of pure concepts of the understanding is limited to the bounds of sense, so we can only apply these pure concepts of the understanding to sensible intuition. But what he says, the part of Kant's epistemology that he considers like part of metaphysics and that he's actually trying to articulate in the Critique of Pure Reason is the part that we can know a priori. The sort of different content that we can derive from experience or from sensation that is too varied and there's too much of it to account for it, and you certainly can't account for it a priori. So it doesn't belong to the science of metaphysics in the way that these pure intuition, pure forms of intuition, pure concepts of understanding, pure concepts of reason do. And that's, I realize that's kind of an idiosyncratic take on this passage. But the conventional interpretation is, this is Kant turning to the subjective conditions of knowledge. And there's a way in which that's true, because he is looking at sensibility and the understanding and reason, which are understood to be sort of different faculties of the soul or different mental cognitive faculties. And I would challenge that conventional interpretation by stressing what Kant is actually concerned about here is a priori cognition, because he thinks metaphysics is a science of a priori cognition. And there's one point in the preface to the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason where he says, metaphysics is basically just like, I think that I forget the word, but it's something like just a catalog of everything we know a priori, arranged systematically. That's a really distinctive view of metaphysics. I, looked into this. I couldn't find any other early modern European philosophers who defined metaphysics in terms of a priori cognition. a lot of them define metaphysics by a certain set of objects, right? It's, the part of philosophy that talks about God and the world and the soul, or that, it's somehow transcendent. It goes beyond sensation, or it goes beyond experience. And that's true. Like, Kant does think metaphysics goes beyond sensation and experience, but in a particular way. He thinks it is concerned with a priori cognition.
See, this is why I'm so glad that I have you here to discuss this with, because I wouldn't have thought of that. I wouldn't have had such a deep and rich answer to that. It's funny. I was speaking with Dennis Schulting about German idealism, and he said something to me that took me aback. He said, Kant's not a German idealist. He's a part of the classical German philosophy circle. German idealism starts with Fichte, and that's the first time I had ever heard that. So I was taken aback by that comment, and so, anyways. But your comment on the Copernican revolution was fantastic. Thank you, and you can respond to what I just said if you like.
Yeah. So I mean, so where you draw the lines between sort of classical German philosophy and German idealism, I think are, we can quibble about the classification of philosophers and the periodization of philosophy, but I think there are some really important differences between Kant and the German idealists that go back to the interpretation of the Copernican revolution. I think somebody like Fichte really does think all cognition derives from the subject in a certain way. So he will even reject Kant's distinction between intuitions and concepts and basically say, well, intuitions are just another kind of concept, right? Everything is mental, and intuition is a mental content. It may represent the not I or refer to the not I or something like that, but it is still a part of the consciousness of the subject. And so Fichte, at least as I understand him, represents a very idealistic interpretation of this turn to the subject and what that would mean. Whereas Kant, I think, says, okay, some aspects of our knowledge depend on us and our mental faculties. So if we're looking at the a priori components of our cognition and experience, those do depend on our mental faculties. But our cognition is also dependent for its content on affection by external objects in the world, and that provides the content for our cognition. So he's a pluralist about, sort of mind and world, or, a dualist about mind and world. Both things exist, they interact. The interaction provides us with the content of our cognition. And I also think that Kant is a pluralist about philosophical principles in a way that the German idealists tend not to be. So Kant is perfectly happy saying, yeah, there are lots of different philosophical principles. I mean, there have to be a small enough number that we can manage them in a science, so we can list them, practically in a book. But the idea that we have to reduce all these different principles to one first principle is not one that Kant, I think, ever really seriously considered. And if you look at the Copernican revolution passage, when he's talking about a priori cognition, he's talking about three distinct kinds of a priori cognition. He's talking about intuitions and concepts and ideas. And he doesn't think those are reducible to any one fundamental kind of thing, or there's one principle that governs them all absolutely. And so I think that is a pretty sharp distinction between sort of Kant on the one hand and sort of philosophers following from Fichte or from Reinhold on the other hand.
Thank you for clearing that up. I was wondering if maybe we could now, well, maybe I could ask you, what do you think Kant's overall project is in his critical philosophy? I mean, that's a very broad question. That's a huge question. So how would you take this overall critical project?
Yeah, so I think that the goal of the critical philosophy is to make metaphysics a science. I think that is very clearly the goal of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant is very explicit about that goal, and he explains how he understands the relationship between the Critique of Pure Reason and the science of metaphysics to work. He also explains how he thinks the science of metaphysics will be sort of arranged or organized, or the parts of it will be classified. And I think that is a project that carries through for the rest of his life. Although it's important to note that Kant, not everything Kant writes, not everything Kant publishes fits into that scheme. So he does write works on other topics that are not part of this project of making metaphysics a science that he starts in the Critique of Pure Reason and really is publishing on until the end of his life. But some things that he publishes don't exactly fit into that scheme. So the Anthropology, for example, or the lectures on pedagogy, or the logic textbook that he publishes, or that U.S.A publishes at the end of Kant's life. Those are not really part of the critical philosophy, although they're related to the critical philosophy in important ways. They're related to Kant's teaching in important ways. They're philosophy, and they're Kantian philosophy, but they don't necessarily fit into this scheme that he sets up in the critical philosophy and tries to work out in different ways over the course of his career. And I'll say a little bit more about how Kant understands the Critique of Pure Reason and the science of metaphysics and the parts of metaphysics. But I do want to stress that we have this image of Kant as a very systematic philosopher who has very technical terminology and very precise arguments, and sort of follows through with Teutonic discipline and precision, right? And I think that image of Kant is pretty inaccurate. So leading up to the Critique of Pure Reason, I think Ernst Cassirer is right that Kant has a very experimental approach to philosophy, that he's just trying out different ideas in print, right? So he's publishing works that say different things because it seems to make sense to him at the time. And he's not fully committed to those positions that he's articulating in some of his pre-critical works. I don't think the pre-critical works form a pre-critical system or anything like that. I think they're experimental. And I think the real difference in the Critique of Pure Reason is that that really becomes the foundation for a whole series of subsequent works that Kant publishes throughout the 1780s and 1790s. And the Critique of Pure Reason is explicitly a propadeutic to the science of metaphysics. And my dissertation and the first book I wrote, although it was the second book that was actually published. So Immanuel Kant and the very idea of a Critique of Pure Reason is just about what does Kant mean by a critique? And I think that idea that a critique is a propadeutic, it sort of lays the foundation for a science, is really the right way to understand the Critique of Pure Reason as a critique. So it's not a critique of rationalism or empiricism or dogmatism or skepticism. It's not that kind of negative, clearing the ground kind of criticism. It's the kind of critique that sort of lays out what you need to know in order to go further. So it lays out the fundamental principles that are necessary for a science of metaphysics. And I think you get that in the transcendental aesthetic and in the transcendental analytic, and the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles. All of those are very sort of constructive in laying out and demonstrating the kind of principles that Kant thinks metaphysics will depend on. And then also in the transcendental dialectic, Kant is telling you what principles you cannot use in a science of metaphysics, or at least that you can't use constitutively in a science of metaphysics. You can still use them regulatively in a certain way. But all of that is
laying the foundation for a science of metaphysics. Kant thinks that science of metaphysics will include a metaphysics of nature and then a metaphysics of morals. There's a way in which that's a version of the sort of Hellenistic division of the parts of philosophy. Kant mentions this in the preface to the Groundwork, where the ancient philosophers divided philosophy into logic, physics, and ethics. There were people in the 18th century, and there are still people today who think the Critique of Pure Reason is kind of like a logic. I think there are reasons to be careful about that, or skeptical about that to a certain degree. Depends what you mean by logic. We don't want to reduce the Critique of Pure Reason to the transcendental logic, for sure, because the aesthetic is also really important. But I think it makes a lot of sense to think of the philosophy of nature and the metaphysics of nature and metaphysics of morals as kind of like physics and ethics in the classical Hellenistic divisions of the parts of philosophy. Although Kant will, of course, give his own definitions of what the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals are meant to be. And if you look at Kant's subsequent publications, he'll publish things like Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Critique of Practical Reason, and the Metaphysics of Morals, which really do seem to carry through that program to write a Metaphysics of Morals. Although all those works do different things, and they don't follow out the program as systematically or as straightforwardly as you might think, given Kant's reputation. The metaphysics of nature is even more complicated because Kant never writes a metaphysics of nature. And if you look at the metaphysical foundations of natural science, it's supposed to be an application of the principles of the metaphysics of nature, which Kant hasn't written. And then you have the writings in the Opus Posthumum, which are supposed to be something like a transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics, the science of physics. But that leaves this huge gap in the system between the Critique of Pure Reason and then the metaphysical foundations. You just don't have a fundamental articulation of the principles of the metaphysics of nature. And so even though you can see Kant publishing works that fit the scheme for the science of metaphysics that Kant projected in the Critique of Pure Reason, the works that he published fit into that scheme in complicated ways, and they are not sort of straightforward systematic articulations of what he promised. And so I think when Reinhold and Fichte criticize Kant for not being sufficiently systematic, it's not just that he doesn't take everything back to first principles, it's also that he doesn't follow through in the way that you might think he should, given the science of metaphysics that he proposed in the Critique of Pure Reason. Yeah, I hope that's a good answer to that question.
No, that's a fantastic answer, actually. I was reading, I believe, Paul Geyer's, is it a biography? I think it's just his work on Kant. And he states that, I guess maybe I'm asking your opinion, so how we can differentiate between the three critiques. Essentially, Geyer states that if we look at what can I know, what ought I to do, what may I hope, these are the three critiques, and the final end project was supposed to be what is a human being. So Geyer is essentially stating that these are the questions. We get the epistemology, we get the ethical connotation from the practical element of pure reason, and then finally the critique of, which was essentially, I think it was supposed to be just on the critique of taste, but then he changed it to the critique of judgment. So I guess maybe how can we differentiate each of these three? And I know that's a huge question to ask you. So, not to overbear you or anything, But how could we differentiate these three separate projects? The critique of pure reason, which you've already highlighted, by the way, very well, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, or the third critique, sorry.
Yeah, so I think this is an important thing to keep in mind when you're reading the three critiques and when you're thinking about Kant's critical philosophy as consisting of three critiques. Kant lays out the program in the critique of pure reason. The critique of practical reason is really kind of a setup for the metaphysics of morals. So you have a critique of pure reason, and that should lead directly to the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals, but Kant writes a groundwork and then another critique to set up the metaphysics of morals. So in the second critique, he's doing something very similar to the first critique, except it's laying the groundwork or laying the foundation for one specific part of metaphysics as opposed to the whole of metaphysics. The third critique is a bit more complicated because, as far as I can tell, Kant had no idea that he would write this critique or that such a critique would be necessary when he published the Critique of Pure Reason. So I don't think he had this plan where it's like, I'm going to write three critiques. He writes one critique, and the way he sets it up, it should lead directly to the metaphysics of morals and the metaphysics of nature. It doesn't. He throws in an additional critique, a critique of practical reason, to set up the metaphysics of morals. And then, in 1787, he says, he's going to write about the critique of taste, but he discovers a sort of principle of systematicity related to teleology that leads him to, he's going to write a critique of taste, and that eventually becomes the critique of the power of judgment. And there he's talking about the reflecting and determining power of judgment, but he's talking about aesthetics, he's talking about biology. That I find to be a very complicated work. So systematically and structurally, how that fits in with Kant's other works, I find that very complicated. So my mentor Rudy McCreel was sort of fascinated by the third critique. I'm really interested in aesthetics and the sort of evolution of Kant's views on aesthetics. But I still struggle with fitting the third critique into the critical philosophy. I will say there's a recent book by Christy Sweet. I have it in the other room. I wish I could remember the title. Actually, I will pull it up on my computer because I have it as a Kindle book and I want to get the title. Okay, so there's also a book by Christy Sweet, and I'm glad I went and got the book because the title that I remembered is actually the subtitle of the book. So it's Kant on Freedom, Nature, and Judgment, the Territory of the Third Critique, where she also argues that the third critique is intended to address that third question, what may I hope for? And there's an argument that you could also say, well, Kant's writings on religion answer the question, what may I hope for? Or certain things he says in his ethical writings would answer the question, what may I hope for? Like when Kant talks about the highest good as the sort of combination of happiness and worthiness for happiness that can't possibly be achieved in this life. That's an answer to the question, what may I hope for? But a lot of scholars have looked to the third critique for the answer to this third question that Kant raises near the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, when he's talking about the questions that exhaust all the interests of reason. So what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope for? The way Kant presents those in the first critique, those are questions about the interests of reason. And in his lectures and in the logic textbook that is published at the end of Kant's life. Kant didn't actually write that book, so saying Kant published it is a little bit inaccurate. But that includes this fourth question, like, what is a human being? And some people, especially like Heidegger, will say that the fourth question is the key to the other three, that, you know, it all sort of goes back to the human being and to subjectivity. I'm a little bit skeptical of that approach, that, you know, the fourth question, the human being, is the answer to the other three, because that seems to make anthropology the key to the critical philosophy. And I don't think that's how Kant understood his anthropology. I'm actually writing about that right now. So it's actually kind of funny how Kant came to the anthropology, which is because Wolff and Baumgarten have these chapters in their metaphysics on empirical psychology, which is what we can know about the human soul through experience. Kant, of course, is committed to the view that metaphysics is a science of pure cognition, of a priori cognition. So anything we can know through experience has to be kicked out of metaphysics. So Kant thinks empirical psychology is really important, especially for intro to philosophy students. You know, intro to philosophy students aren't going to get that much from, you know, ontology, this very abstract, very technical part of philosophy, but they could gain a lot from empirical psychology. And so Kant develops a new series of lectures that takes the content of empirical psychology, like acknowledges that it's empirical, but still says it's valuable and useful for people to study. You can gain all kinds of valuable knowledge from studying human beings, you know, empirically. That gives you practical or pragmatic knowledge or information you can use to make prudential judgments. But it just doesn't belong in metaphysics. So I think there's a kind of, given the definition of metaphysics that he employs, anthropology can't be part of metaphysics because it's empirical. The only things that we can use from psychology are those parts that we can know a priori, namely the conditions of sensibility, the conditions of thought, whether they're, you know, the pure forms of intuition or concepts or ideas. So given that that's where Kant's anthropology comes from, I really don't think anthropology can be the key to the critical philosophy. And the question of hope kind of sits uncomfortably with talk about both aesthetics and biology. But you know, people like Geyer and Christy Sweet really do make the case that the three critiques correspond to these three questions. And really what Kant is after in the third critique is a certain kind of philosophical hope. For Sweet, I'm not finished reading the book. I'm actually going to be reviewing it. But she's talking about sort of the kind of hope that Kant presents in the third critique has to do with the possibility that nature and freedom can go together, that they don't have to be sort of an either or separate realms, but there can be a way to combine them or make them consistent with one another. And I think that's an interesting and, you know, certainly compelling philosophical project. And it really does speak to the kind of human and, for some people, kind of existential concerns that I think Kant really did care about. And that I think when you read his lectures and when you read his anthropology, when you read his political writings, he really is an academic, scholastic philosopher who really cares about arguments and distinctions and terminology, but also about these very human concerns, and doesn't always address them at the same time. but sometimes he does.
I wanted that was fantastic. I wanted to ask you about some of Kant's critics, and they can be. I I actually didn't. I just thought of this question now. I wanted to ask your opinion. What are your thoughts on Reinhold's critique of Kant and Maimon?
Yeah, I don't feel qualified to talk about Maimon right now because I have read Maimon. I have not read Maimon for a very long time, and I don't feel like I have a good enough handle on his work or on his arguments to really talk about them. I've done more work with Reinhold. I co-edited a book on critique in German philosophy with Maria del Rosario Costa Lopez, and I wrote a chapter in that book on Reinhold and Fichte's critique of Kant's conception of critique, basically. And I think I'm not sure that I think Reinhold's criticism of so there's a certain criticism of Kant that Reinhold makes, which is that intuitions and concepts and ideas are all different representations, but Kant never explains the power, the faculty of representation, which would have to be the faculty in which all these other faculties are grounded. I think there's a way in which Reinhold is missing Kant's critique of Wolff, and specifically Wolffian rational psychology when he's making that argument. This is something that Corey Dyke talks about, and his book Kant and Rational Psychology, I think, is really, really fantastic. Wolff thinks of the soul as a power of representation. And if you look at Kant's lectures on metaphysics, when Kant talks about rational psychology, Kant is aware that Wolff thinks the soul is a power of representation. And at a certain point in his intellectual development or in his career, like I think around the time that he's publishing the inaugural dissertation, Kant really does think you could know the soul intellectually as a power of representation. I think by the time he publishes the first critique, and you really get this sort of rejection of knowledge of things in themselves in Kant, and you get the arguments that Kant includes in the paralogisms. Kant has good reason to deny that we could ever know the soul as a fundamental power of representation. And I think that is something that, at least as I have read Reinhold, Reinhold doesn't really engage with that specific argument. And he doesn't sort of think to like, well, if you know the power of representation, you have to know what the soul is in itself. Maybe Reinhold deals with that problem elsewhere than in the text that I read, but at least some of his arguments against Kant rely on sort of identifying a power or faculty that Kant doesn't think you can know. So I think that also has to do with something like Fichte's critique of Kant and the sort of the conception of the I that Fichte is working with. I think Kant would just deny that you could have knowledge of that I, or you could have legitimate arguments of deducing things from the I, because it requires sort of knowledge of something in itself. I don't know whether Kant is right about that. I don't know if I'm being entirely fair to Fichte when I make that claim, because I'm also aware that Fichte presents his arguments in a variety of different forms, in different contexts, in different times. And I'm not sure that the kinds of objections that Kant raises against Fichte in the sort of open letter are really as decisive as Kant thinks they are. But if I'm speaking from Kant's perspective about why you wouldn't want to say deduce nature and freedom from the I, it would have something to do with the I being a thing in itself, and therefore not being an object of knowledge or an object of possible cognition for someone or something with the specific cognitive faculties that I have and the specific conditions under which on which my cognition depends that we have. I don't know if that's a good argument. I'm hoping I'm not doing too much injustice to Reinhold and Fichte when I
No, I think you did a fine job. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think my last question to you is kind of highlighting your work, because part of this series isn't just about the thinkers, but also the people that I have invited over here to speak about. So here's a question for you. How did you get into working on Kant? Who introduced you to Kant first? And how do you use Kant within your own scholarship right now?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I actually don't really remember who introduced me to Kant. Kant was always sort of on the borders of what I was reading and what I was studying when I was an undergraduate. I was sort of educated in the sort of continental tradition at Loyola Chicago, and I read a lot of Hegel as an undergraduate. And I think I got curious about Kant from reading actually probably Marx and then Hegel, and then kind of went back to Kant. And I do remember that when I was doing my master's degree, I really found Kant a challenge. So it was a rewarding challenge to read the Critique of Pure Reason and to really kind of work out sort of the structure of the book and also how individual arguments fit within that structure. And I think when I was doing my master's degree, I was also raising questions about, or I was also sensitive to the way in which I was getting a very canonical view of the history of philosophy, so a very select number of European figures and a very small number of works. And also I was realizing, wow, there's a whole lot more out there than what I'm reading. And one of the interesting things about Kant is just, yeah, he is a place where a lot of those narratives and a lot of the canon sort of comes together. But when you read what canonical philosophers say about Kant and the way they relate their own projects back to what he's doing, it often doesn't square well with what Kant actually says. And just, I think I mentioned this before, but so many people treating Kant as a critic of metaphysics when he's actually trying to make metaphysics a science. That really is a point where I think in the construction of canons, people often play fast and loose with even canonical figures and works. So you can sort of break the canon by going beyond it and sort of incorporating figures and works that have been excluded from the canon. Or you can look closely at figures and works that are included in the canon and see how they say things other than what the canon is supposed to say. So in a way, like the canon is narrow and internally inconsistent. The philosophers in the canon don't say what the canon says they say. And, right, there are a whole bunch of works by these philosophers that aren't in the canon that really do give you a more accurate and better perspective on the works that are canonical. And so I think just given my background and my education, I was kind of well positioned to look at Kant as a sort of canonical figure. I had really good support when I was doing my PhD to look at the sort of 18th century German context of Kant's philosophy. And that was from Ursula Goldenbaum, who's sort of was educated in East Germany, but came to Emory University in the early 2000s, and she's primarily a Spinoza and Leibniz scholar, but very, very knowledgeable about 18th century German philosophy, and that just gave me such a rich context for understanding Kant. And then also I worked with Rudy McQuillan, who's a third critique Kantian. Rudy really loved the third critique. He also did work on Dilthey and Neo-Kantianism, which is another set of contexts for understanding Kant and Kant's reception and sort of appropriations of Kantian philosophy and different Kantian projects in the history of philosophy. And so I think, I liked the challenge of Kant. I liked the way in which Kant looked different in historical context than he does in sort of the narrative that you get from different philosophical canons. And I liked that this was a place that I could view the different appropriations of Kantian philosophy and see, okay, this is what they're taking, but this is also what they're leaving out. And that was, that's always an interesting project for me. And so I've done that with, as my answers about Reinhold and Fichte might suggest, like, I've read my German Idealism. I unfortunately haven't read them for many years now, because I've sort of gone in the opposite direction, and I've looked at the sort of philosophical sources that are preceding Kant and that he's drawing on to a large extent, especially the sort of the Wolffian tradition, and that includes Baumgarten and Meyer, who are not orthodox Wolffians, but are using Wolffian concepts and definitions and arguments. One of the things that I'm really fascinated about right now is the fact that Kant divides the doctrine of elements and the Critique of Pure Reason into a transcendental aesthetic and a transcendental logic. And, a lot of people are sort of overwhelmed enough trying to read the Critique of Pure Reason that they don't stop and think, it's really weird that, two of the main parts of this book are aesthetics and logic. That's a strange pairing. Like, of all the things you would like sort of identify as the elements of a Critique of Pure Reason that leads to a science of metaphysics, aesthetics and logic don't really seem like prime candidates. But it really makes a lot of sense if you go back and you look at Baumgarten and you look at the way he understood aesthetics, and the sort of psychology that he was relying on. And there really is this sort of complementarity of aesthetics and logic in Baumgarten that is, I think, totally lost on contemporary philosophers who think about aesthetics from the contemporary perspective. So I think one of the things I'm doing is just re-weirding the history of philosophy, like making clear how strange even these sort of familiar and canonical works are, because they rely on almost totally forgotten sort of distinctions and classifications in the history of philosophy or the history of science or something like that. So I've been writing a book it's called Aesthetics and Logic, The Elements of Kant's Critique. I've been working on that since 2018. The end is in sight, but it's not done yet. So I hope to finish that at some point.
Well, I hope when you finish that text, you'll come back and we can discuss your book, because that would be awesome.
Thank you very much, Chris.
I did not know much about Baumgarten and Meyer. I only knew about Baumgarten because of a discussion I had with Justin Atlas about Mendelssohn. And I'm actually going to have Corey Dyke on here to discuss Wolff. So so that's great. So off camera, before we started recording, he gave this really wonderful breakdown of who Baumgarten was and Meyer and their relation with Wolff and Kant, and in your article that I was highlighting before in this text, you do such a great job when you're talking about aesthetic perfection. So thank you so much for being here and for giving us such a rich understanding of Kant. Your passion really speaks through when you talk about certain aspects of Kant, which is really, really, really nice. And it helps a lot when viewers are trying to understand who Kant is and grasp these rich concepts. You really brought him to life. So I want to thank you so much for being here and taking the time out of your really busy day to be a part of this series.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I really hope it's helpful to people, and that some people actually watch it. That's it's always interesting. As a scholar, you kind of like work in isolation a lot of times, and I teach at a liberal arts college, and I mostly teach Intro to Philosophy and Ethics. I only get to teach something like modern philosophy every few years, so getting to talk with people about the stuff that I work on and that I'm really fascinated by is a kind of rare experience, given my career trajectory. And so, yeah, it's very nice to be invited and to be a part of this. So, yeah, thank you very much.
And when I post the video, I will also post links to all of your work as well too, because I really want people to see your writing. You're very good writers. So thank you so much, and have a good day.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.